Hey, everyone, and welcome back to the Nick Halaris Show. Our guest this week is my good friend, longtime friend, Mack Jenkins. He's a partner at Hecker Fink and the founding member of the LA office. Welcome to the show, Mack.
Thanks, Nick. Always great to talk to you, and even now on a podcast.
Yeah, man, I'm looking forward to this conversation.
Likewise.
You've been up to some really interesting stuff over the last, 15 or 20 years since we first met. And I've enjoyed sort of picking your brain off the record. And I think that people are going to enjoy hearing some of these stories. So thanks for being here.
Great. It's my pleasure.
Why don't we start with just tell me what you're up to now. I know you got this new role, an existing firm, but kind of a new office here in LA. What's going on?
Yeah. So as you mentioned, in the 17 years since I left Gibson Dunn, where we originally met many years ago, for those 17 years, I was at the Department of Justice, specifically at the U.S. Attorney's Office in the Central District of California, which is Los Angeles. It came a time where I wouldn't say I did everything I thought I could do at the U.S. Attorney's Office. I think that's never true. But at the same time, I did about 100 times more things that I thought were capable. I was very proud of the work we did there at the office. And it came time for me to look for other opportunities. And it became clear that there's a very, very unique opportunity in Hecker Fink, a law firm that's known for mission-oriented public interest litigation, but primarily in New York and on the East Coast. They have a significant New York presence. They have a Washington, D.C. office, but no West Coast office. And there are people that I respected and thought highly of who kept telling me I should check out this place, Hecker Fink. And ultimately I did. I met some of the name partners, Sean Hecker and Julie Fink. But really it's the work that drew me there. And when they decided that they were interested in me, but also interested in developing an LA office, it really became sort of a match made in legal heaven.
Nice. And when you say mission, give me a flavor of what that means to you.
Sure. So to me, one of the few downsides of working for a place like the U.S. Attorney's Office, where it's not cliche to say our job was to do justice every single day, and I think we sought to do that every single day as all the people there. To go from doing that from wake up to falling asleep to doing other legal jobs, it's sometimes a significant switch in sort of the mission, the people you work with, the type of cases. It's a difficult transition. But at Hecker Fink, the people there, they really care about doing cases that matter to them, to the culture, to society, to democracy, to things that are of the moment at that time. And they've been able to be very successful at getting those cases and having success in those cases, at the same time paying very great wages for their associates and attracting a lot of associate attention. So they did cases such as prosecuting a white supremacist, not prosecuting, civilly suing a white supremacist organization involved in the Charlottesville death of Heather Heyer during a white supremacist rally there, where they got millions of dollars in damages related to that. And that's just an example of type of cases that are both in the public interest, but also have some, in some cases, financial compensation. And then they just kept doing cases like that. And that really put them on the map and definitely put them on my map.
That's cool. Yeah, it does seem like a rare kind of focus for a law firm because, it's been a long time since I've been in the game. But back when I was in it, it was like, which private equity company are you going to represent, or what Fortune 500 patent litigation matter do you want to be working on?
I think that is still a very lucrative and successful makeup at a lot of big firms. And so I think the advantage of, I think it's described as a litigation boutique. I think they're just more in vogue, they're more popular. And in part because there's a lot of younger attorneys that, aren't just doing it for the name brand of a firm or, how much their signing bonus is going to be. But these millennials or whatever generation we're in now, they want to do stuff that matters. And so we don't have the monopoly on doing cases that matter, but it's certainly sort of branded in our mission statement. And other firms do similar stuff. And those are the firms now that are attracting some of the great clerks or great associates or Supreme Court clerks, because these young new associates, they want to do, use their law school for good. A lot of people say they want to go to law school to make a difference. I think a lot of people these days really want to put their money where their mouth is, or at least their legal decision where their mouth is in choosing a firm.
Yeah, I agree completely. Like I've interviewed something like 80 people for this podcast.
Yeah.
About half of them are pursuing some kind of mission-focused business. And so I'm seeing it across all levels of the culture. Like I think that zeitgeist is here to stay.
Yep.
People are interested in making money and being successful.
Yeah.
Like that part of the American story is
Sure.
not gone. But they also actually do want to have some kind of bigger purpose to attach to, and not just like, let me get paid like as much as I can and go on vacation.
Absolutely. And I think that zeitgeist has infected, in a good way, the legal industry. And I think the legal industry is better because of it.
Yeah, totally. When you think about the mission of the LA office that you're putting together here, like, are you going to focus on regional issues, or is it more just trying to get talent to pursue cases that are national of interest, or does it not work that way?
Yeah, no, I think it works sort of all of those ways. Certainly, a lot of the cases that we are focused on and sort of mission impact are national, if not international. These are human issues. These are national issues. These are international issues. And so a lot of that, maybe the epicenter for a lot of it is in New York and in DC, but certainly Los Angeles is the epicenter for all types of legal issues, civil rights issues, and in many ways, what gets a lot of attention to things that happen in California. And so the idea that they'd basically be much more responsive to things that happen in California or impact California and have sort of boots on the ground in terms of an office there, they said ultimately made sense for them. But I'll credit them. They said they weren't necessarily looking to do an LA office. They were just looking for the right people to build out, again, that mission-driven focus and that culture. And so when we crossed paths and I said, I like New York. I went to the law school on the East Coast, but I came right back because I'm more Southern California. But they said, you know what? Well, let's see if we can make this work. And certainly there's work here. There's people here. There's talent here. And not that I'm going to poach associates from our New York and DC office, but we have better weather. We have some attractors. So I expect we'll get great talent and the cases will follow.
Yeah, and the hours are slightly better.
Yeah.
You get done earlier when the East Coast gets done. Yeah, it's
better.
Exactly.
There's several advantages.
Totally. So just want to rewind the clock because when we met, you were working at another big law firm, Gibson Dunn, but you quickly left there and have pursued, basically a mission-driven career for the last 2 decades. When you look back in your upbringing, like, did you always know that was a case, or is it something that emerged later in your life in your 20s, and you're like, you know what, this corporate stuff isn't for me? What's the story there?
Yeah, no, good question, and one that I thought about after I stayed at a job. I wasn't sure how long I was going to stay, and stayed there 17 years. And certainly it's part of my upbringing. I was lucky enough to grow up in a 2-parent household in Irvine, California. Great public schools, great sort of city support. But that was juxtaposed against where my parents grew up, both from very low-income families in Long Beach, California. Where when I would go visit them, particularly my dad's side of the family, really, really large. He's one of almost a dozen family members, brothers and sisters. But the way they interacted with their community, with the police, with their local government was night and day different than how we did it in Irvine. My parents had me when they were very young. They both went to UCI. My dad's black, my mom's white. Being in an interracial relationship in the 70s, both on academic scholarships, was challenging in ways that I couldn't even describe for my parents. But my parents were very proud and focused on family. But my dad is a longtime, he was ultimately the chief probation officer for San Diego County, one of the first black chiefs in the state. So both law enforcement friendly, but also if you know anything about probation officers, part of what they're doing is not just law enforcement, but ideally rehabilitating people so they don't end up back in the system. So my dad always, to me, sort of had a foot in both worlds of both sort of law enforcement and rehabilitation. But he had a great respect for the law, but I'd also seen how sometimes people in power and the law treated people in low-income societies or people of different colors differently. So once I realized that there was a place that sort of put truth to power or could combat police, law enforcement, the federal government, being the U.S. Attorney's Office, really put people in check, put entities in check. Once it became clear that is an institution that existed in our country and that was revered and powerful, and that you needed a law school education to do that, that became my goal, to be in a position where I could push back on abuses of power. And I was very fortunate. I went to Yale Law School, and not just a good law school, but being surrounded with people who were there to not make the most money, but to make the biggest impact. That definitely infected, again, I'm using infected and sort of in the wrong way, that definitely impacted the type of lawyer I wanted to be. And that's how I ended up at the U.S. Attorney's Office when I saw they were doing the type of work was the reason I went to law school.
That's interesting. And your dad, like when you were a kid, did he have like ongoing mentorship with people on probation? Like, were these people around the house and stuff like that?
They weren't around the house because a lot of them were in juvenile hall, because originally he was the assistant director of the juvenile hall, which is for their incarcerated juveniles. But sort of the opposite. My dad would take me and then our basketball team, our AAU basketball team, as a sort of scared straight, but it was sort of the opposite. Because what I saw when I went to see my dad at work and saw kids in cages was the way they interacted with my dad. They saw my dad, a lot of them were black and brown. My dad is black. They looked at my dad as like a mentor, not as some like jailer, because he treated them that way. And even my dad, I felt like I was in jail sometimes at home, and to see how he treated these people in juvenile hall, it was really inspiring. And that, again, he could see them as humans who needed help, humans who didn't get to be raised in Irvine like I did. And, it's sort of, again, a cliche, but not if I had similar circumstances as some of them, not have the parents I did, not grow up in Irvine. I've made plenty of mistakes in my life. They could have ended up very differently. But because I had my parents, my family, and support network, and where I grew up, I got to go to Yale Law School. And, some of those people that never came back to the system, and I definitely credit my dad's involvement, given anytime someone who's never been cared for, seeing particularly like a black male figure supporting them or caring about them, I could see how they lit up when my dad came around. And I definitely saw the value in when law enforcement reaches out, sort of, whether it's through the bars or to someone who's used to, not getting their hand reached out to by law enforcement. But when they do that, the reaction they give back, I saw, again, the sort of duality of how law enforcement cannot just, is not punitive, but also rehabilitative and ideally a deterrent by keeping people out of the system.
Yeah, absolutely. Is your dad still working?
He retired, and now he's a full-time grandparent, but at the same time, he still works on criminal justice reform, mental health reform in prisons. He's on the National Court of Drug Court Professionals. So he's retired, but has a bunch of other jobs.
Yeah, I feel like people who get into careers like that where they're helping young people in particular, they never quit.
I think that's right.
Yeah. And did he just fall into that? This is fascinating.
Yeah.
Did he fall into that career, or how did that happen?
Yeah, I think the good and bad part of the story is my dad was 22 when he had me. He was in college. It was second of three boys. And he sort of got started on his family earlier than planned.
Yeah.
But again, I always try not to second guess sort of life and life choices. But I think had he not had kids at an early age, my dad certainly would be an awesome judge. He would be a tremendous lawyer. But having that kids that early from a low-income family where he didn't have a lot of financial support, had love and all the tremendous resources that love can provide, but financially he needed to get a job. So when my dad was in college, my mom actually dropped out so she could take care of me and my brothers, and then my future brother, Adam. My dad stayed in school, worked as a janitor, worked as a shoe salesman, and then he was a criminal justice major. And one of the best jobs he got offered after college was at the Orange County probation department for the juvenile hall, where he rose the ranks for 35 years until he became the chief of San Diego.
That's very cool. What a great story.
Thank you.
I did a little work in juvenile hall in law school. There's this program called Street Law.
Yeah.
And we basically, law students would go into these juvenile facilities and try to educate the kids about their legal rights and stuff.
Yeah.
And it's really, it's a sobering, especially we're 23, 24-year-old kids at Stanford Law School.
Sure.
Our ability to relate to the life trajectory of these individuals that we're talking to is low.
Yeah.
But it was kind of eye-opening for sure.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I bet, I bet those kids remembered it too.
Yeah.
And,
I hope so. We try to make a difference. And what you realize, like all these things, right? You hear people talk on the news about criminals and whatever.
Sure.
But these are just people.
Yes.
And, I was listening to a podcast. I actually forget the author's name, but he's basically he wrote a book about criminal justice reform. And the one thing I remembered from the podcast is all about the book, is that the difference between someone in jail and someone not is less than 10 minutes of choice. Something is going on in 10 minutes that completely changes the trajectory of someone's life. They make a bad choice. Boom, they're all of a sudden in the prison system. And in our age, maybe in every age, once you get in, it's difficult to get out. And it creates this ridiculously negative feedback loop.
Yeah, no, I think that's all right. And I certainly saw that regularly when I would go and see. I also tell the story. A couple of times I would see my friends from high school. I went to Woodbridge High School in Irvine. But some of my friends ended up in juvenile hall, and they would come out later and be like, "I saw your dad." I'm like, "Where'd you see my dad?" "Oh, when I was locked up."
Yeah.
And they're like, that talk like it was like the greatest time. But I'm like, these are people, that also had similar backgrounds to me, went to the same high school, and made some clearly poor choices that where they ended up in juvenile hall. But they're also the kids I talked about where they came back because of that experience in juvenile hall, better or less likely to make similar choices in the future. But I credit their experiences in juvenile hall that gave them sort of a second chance. Whereas in some places you go in and that second chance is illusory, unfortunately.
Yeah. Well, I had written down I wanted to ask you about criminal justice reform at the end of our interview,
Sure.
but since we got into this right
Sure.
now, like let's talk about it right now. Like what you've been here in California, which has sort of been one of the ground zeros at the attempt at criminal justice reform. What's your take?
Sure. This is a good time to do my disclaimer. So, although I'm not currently at the Department of Justice, I did work there for 17 years. These opinions are my own and my personal capacity, not reflect those of the Department of Justice or the U.S. Attorney's Office or my current firm, Hecker Fink. So, criminal justice reform, I think, is, again, one of the, you sort of touched on this, there's some sort of buzzwords these days that get attached or, to extremes, like very negative, very positive, where, of course, like most things, there's a lot of nuance. So, and I say that because I've worked for 4 different political administrations, 2 Republicans, 2 Democrats, and criminal justice reform is always on a topic of conversation because clearly we have not figured it out. There's still a lot of people in prison. There's still a lot of violence. So I think, people talk about the extremes and again, sort of demonizing one side or the other. But in fact, everyone's for criminal justice reform. It's just how to get there. And so and I think part of that is once you recognize that and realize people are on the same, maybe different sides of the same page, but on the same page, it makes for more productive conversations. So in my most recent stint under the U.S. Attorney Martin Estrada, who's a former AOSA, and then came back to be U.S. Attorney, I would say he's a very hard-charging prosecutor, but very thoughtful and realized that, again, our ideal function at the U.S. Attorney's Office is really to prevent crime, not just as a punitive body. Because if we prevent crime, then the world is better off. And part of that is criminal justice reform. And so a lot of it was dialoguing with community groups, other law enforcement entities, whether it be federal agencies or local or the district attorney's office, and figuring out what works and doesn't work. Do, for example, mandatory minimums work? Mandatory minimum is where the judge basically has no discretion, and ultimately the person who has discretion is the prosecutor. Meaning when we used to charge a case a certain way, based off a certain statute, if the defendant was convicted of that, then there's a mandatory minimum, which means it doesn't matter what the judge thought, it can go higher but cannot go lower unless they cooperated, and there's different avenues for that. And so there's a lot of discussions about when those mandatory minimums were appropriate. And under the last administration, under Attorney General Merrick Garland, what he ultimately said is consistent with the case law, things should be more individualized. So not that mandatory minimums are anathema, it's a statute, but not necessarily applied in sort of robotic form. And that appealed to me, like treating, as you said before, humans like humans. Case specifics, you got to do your job. How egregious is this? Is there room for leniency? Is leniency appropriate? Are there victims involved? And to me, it just made criminal justice reform means we got to do our job better. And I was very interested in finding out ways to do it better. And sometimes that meant sticking to that mandatory minimum. Other times it meant, well, maybe we can find another route so this person can go back to society and have an upward trajectory at life. Obviously, it's not foolproof. We couldn't guarantee results, but having that as one of the questions, as opposed to here's the statute, here's the crime, the end. It's like a math problem. To me, it's not a math problem. It's a human problem that we're still working to solve.
Yeah, that seems to me to be the most rational approach to this, but I think it's maybe politically difficult because it's easy for people to get hyped up like, oh, if you commit a crime, you're mandatory 30. That sounds really good on a stump speech, right?
Sure.
But it just doesn't necessarily work out for society.
I think that is what history and current today has proven true. There's still a lot of work to go.
What do you think of the bail reform stuff?
So it's more of a state thing because in federal court, we don't have sort of what's called no cash bail, which California has changed. And so I can speak more intelligently about the federal system, where again, it's much more focused on, is this person, it's really a 2-factor test. Is this person a danger to society, or is there a risk of flight or non-compliance? Those are the 2 factors. It wasn't how much money do they have. Like money is a component, But the first two questions were, should this person be detained in the first place? And that was a significant question because, as any criminal defense attorney will tell you, having their client in custody changes the dynamic, changes their legal relationship, their access, changes sort of the morale of that defendant. And sometimes that's appropriate because of the danger or because they're not going to comply. And other times it seems to have an adverse effect on the system. And so in federal court, it was much more rooted in the facts of the case and the charges. And then the financial component was sort of secondary, meaning in cases I prosecuted, there would be, it's called a $100,000 signatory bond, which sounds like a lot, but really just means the defendant or his mom or her husband sign a piece of paper that say if they don't comply, if they do something else illegal, you're on the hook. That person's on the hook. But you don't have to put up $100,000. You don't have to put up 10%. You just put your name on paper. In some more significant cases, we would make you put up $100,000 in cash or put up your house again, but it wasn't sort of, this is the amount, and regardless of your ability to pay, we make you pay it or you stay in jail. So I think it's moving towards more of the federal model, which I'm more comfortable with and support.
I see. And what was your take on, this is more local politics stuff, but for a while, we had a pro-reform DA locally, Gascon, who recently got voted out in pretty much a landslide. And yeah, just what's your take on that?
Sure. Yeah. So I will say, I know Jackie Lacey, I know George Gascon, and I know Nathan Hochman, the current district attorney. All very different views. And what I think is generally having a leader who is in touch with what's happening in the cases, both with the facts, but also the prosecutors and the defense attorneys, and being collaborative is the best way to go about any reform, basically getting buy-in. And so I don't want to comment too specifically because I know all of those individuals, but I do think there seems to be more of a trend towards let's get the buy-in of the rank and file and make sure we're in touch with sort of what the issues are, because I think everyone has, again, these distinct political views, but that's great to sort of say, like you said, on stump speech, but actually what's happening and what's going to help. And so I think, I'm just hopeful that those continued collaborations and conversations with the whole criminal justice family, and not just sort of what someone said on a political speech, but okay, let's look at what the problems are and how to fix them. And so I think criminal justice reform and bail reform needs to have those people's investment.
I see. Meaning like the rank and file prosecutors. It's interesting you say that because there's several members of my gym that are prosecutors actually. And they were complaining about leadership actually in the last administration. And basically it kind of confirms what you're saying about like, maybe there's a way to do this, but you need to get the rank and file to buy in, like any sort of corporate change effort.
Sure.
Right? This is not different than any large scale leadership effort. You need to get the prosecutors to understand why maybe you want to take a different approach. That's interesting.
Yeah, and I'll just, again, without getting too much of it because it's not my office and I want to support them. I think there's some misconception about the prior administration's popularity. But it was less, I think, about some of the positions, because some of the positions, I will say, from a prosecutor perspective, from a longtime career prosecutor, the last administration had some good ideas about making the process more fair, better, more efficient. But I think sometimes that message or conclusion gets lost and becomes difficult to achieve. But I do think, again, I think people are asking the right questions in leadership. And in different ways about how to get those answers or sort of convey those answers to the rank and file and to the public. And so that's also why I'm not a politician.
Yeah. I think it's really tough. Like during the election, I listened to some podcasts with Gascon on them, and I'm sort of a compassionate guy. Like I probably wouldn't be a great prosecutor. So I was finding myself sort of like intellectually and emotionally inclined to a lot of the positions of the reform. Like if you take a step back and just look at like the data, like the data is undeniable. We have a racial discrimination problem in the justice system. We got a problem with like recidivism and the prison system being like the worst possible intervention that you could give a young person in particular who commits a crime. Like prison is actually guaranteed essentially the way it's structured now to create a lifetime criminal. And actually, the Attorney General of New Mexico was on the podcast. Raul Torres, a friend of mine from law school.
Oh, wow.
And he said the same thing. He's like, criminal justice reform is critical because what we're doing now is just so obviously doesn't work. Like it doesn't really even prevent crime and may even arguably make it worse. And then there's all these other really bad side effects like, hey, it's racially biased in a significant way. And so we can't just we can't do nothing. We can't keep doing what we're doing. And we got to just keep trying to iterate was his thought process on it.
Yeah, I think that makes sense and circles back to sort of where we began on this is I do think actually a lot of people agree that it's not working. And if you start from that premise as opposed to because this person believes it or because this person believes it, I'm inherently against it, or because it's called criminal justice reform means that it's about leniency and about letting out murderers. I'm like, there's not too many prosecutors that are on board with that policy. But sort of to your point, when you sort of look behind the sort of rhetoric and look at the thoughtfulness, you may not agree with all the ideas, but I think you come away with a better understanding of, okay, this is what they're trying to accomplish. Because I think right now there's being thoughtful about these difficult questions and having conversations with people on different perspectives is the best way to achieve it. And I think that remains possible.
Yeah, totally. There was a woman on the podcast, and I'm blanking on her name because it was 3 years ago, but she was working on a criminal justice reform startup idea.
Okay.
And she was working in Chicago, and she was explaining to me the reason why bail reform was important in her perspective. And it was there's a fundamental difference, which you sort of hinted at, in the access for attorneys. Let's say, the amount of time you get to spend with your client. But she also was suggesting that there was a perception gap. So if somebody is incarcerated at the time of their trial, they come dressed a different way because they're wearing their prison stuff. I forget exactly what she was saying, but it was you just start off in a worse position, so you're more likely to lose in the case.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point because I was saying federal court for that exact reason. Sometimes they come looking better because they are provided clothing to make it appear as if they came from a business meeting.
Okay, plain clothes.
Sometimes there's sometimes fundings to get them a suit. Although if it's a multi-day trial, they end up wearing the same suit a lot. But we're sort of sitting in front of a bench, but there's drapery to cover their feet in case they are shackled. There's been litigation about making sure that none of the shackles can be seen, so their hands are actually free, even if once the jury's, and this is outside of the presence of the jury, they're shackled in front of the jury. They have clothes on. You can't see the shackles. There's U.S. Marshals in the audience, but you can't tell that they're U.S. Marshals. They're the Marshals who normally wear Marshals and have guns or tasers visible. During trial, they're dressed in their suits and everything's covered for that exact reason, because certainly in America and anywhere else, perception, sometimes can have an outsized influence. And so and it's something I definitely appreciated, the extra lengths that are made to make sure that does not infect a jury trial in federal court.
Interesting. How many, in your days at the AUSA, how many trials did you do?
I did 17 or 18 trials. One is sort of a misdemeanor, so I sometimes count.
Okay. And how many cases did you work on? I mean, it's
17, hundreds. Yeah, hundreds.
Okay.
Hundreds of cases, probably over 1,000 defendants. I did a lot of what we call multi-defendant cases, particularly gang or racketeering cases. And then also I supervised a bunch. So hundreds of cases, probably 1,000 defendants.
And most of the time they end in some kind of plea deal. Is that what?
Yes, is the short answer. So 17 trials out of hundreds of cases, and then most resolved by guilty pleas, sometimes with some level of diversion, but by the high majority, high 95%. I'd have to do the math, but definitely consistent with federal cases across the country, they ended in pleas.
What's your favorite part of a trial?
Yeah, I think the favorite part of trial to me is talking to the jury. To me, it's not because that's the part you see growing up watching TV, but it is a part where this is, for me, where I felt the most connection to my job. I'm literally talking to a jury of the defendant's peers and ideally my peers, and I feel very confident in my vision of what happened in this case and what should happen with their jobs. But at the same time, as I told all the prosecutors that I worked with and worked for me, once you do that, our job is done. There's a jury and there's a judge. Our job is to present the case in the most fair and most compelling, consistent with our ethics and our oath to prosecute cases vigorously. But it's a jury's job to convict, not ours. It's our judge's job to pick balls and strikes, and it's our job to do justice. But if that jury decides that justice means not guilty or hung jury, that to me, it doesn't always feel the same way, but that to me is the same as that jury coming back guilty. We did our job, the jury did theirs. And as long as I felt that we did to the best of our ability, the system works. And I like being a part of the system because to me, it's much harder being a juror than a prosecutor or a defense attorney, because as a juror, you're just left with what information they give you. I'd much rather being in the system, being in the process to find that truth. And so being able to convey that to the jury, it really is a privilege, because someone's life and liberty is at stake. And every part of my job when I was there, but most tangibly, and I think most urgently, when you're asking a jury to find someone guilty of a crime, and they're in some degree, they're trusting the evidence, they're trusting your arguments, but that jury's also looking to you, particularly as a prosecutor, for integrity and credibility in what you're saying. And that was never lost on me, the augustness of that process.
Yeah, well said. I've always been fascinated by just the idea of it. I've wanted to get on a jury, but every time I go, it's not. It doesn't happen. I don't know why. Maybe actually after this next question, maybe you'll tell me why I don't get on a jury. But my question is like, it seems like this magical process, but instinctively it feels like it's like the right process. Like there's something about the engaging between human beings in dialogue in private that the truth can come out. Like, what's your take? Is the truth coming out in the jury system?
I think so. Again, I can only speak to federal court, where I've practiced exclusively. And I think, yes, I think it is an amazing, in some ways, sort of miraculous system, because I think the truth does come out in a way that is still dependent on humans to do it. Obviously, humans inherently flawed, systems they create inherently flawed, and the justice system far from public. But our trial adversarial system is, an international leader for a reason. Because it has, frankly, so many checks and balances, which I think are very urgently important in all systems of government, but particularly in the justice system. And it's, there's limits on the judge, there's limits on the jury, there's limits on the prosecutor, there's limits on the defense attorney, all aimed with an idea that if it enhances truth, then we will allow it. If it distorts the truth or undermines the truth, then we will keep it out or don't do it. And so that's why I think truth, particularly in federal court, where frankly we have more time, the cases are less reactionary, we have limited resources, which means we really handpick our cases. So we're also, frankly, more have the ability to be more confident in what we're presenting. And I think the right result is a consequence.
Yeah. Why do you think I've never been selected to a jury?
That's interesting. What are you answering when they ask you questions, Nick?
I don't know. It's been a long time since. But like usually I never get past like, what do you do for a living? That kind of stuff. Like I never even get past that.
Yeah, because it's not inside baseball, but typically as a prosecutor, you just want someone innocuous and not crazy.
Yeah.
Meaning someone who's not going to hijack the jury, make them stay a long time, and just can be fair. That was ultimately the question in federal court. Can you be fair? Yeah, you have this experience. Yeah, you had that experience, but can you be fair? And do you remember were yours state court? Were you at CCB?
Yeah, I've never actually been called up for federal case. Yeah.
Because I'd be surprised. Because federal court also often moves faster because the judges just want to get things going. So unless, sometimes they're just sort of proactively crazy person usually. Someone who has the time and like can listen and be thoughtful. Like for me, you'd be an ideal juror.
Okay, thank you. Well, that's a vote of confidence.
That's what this is about. Your validation. I'm happy to say I'd put you on my jury.
All right, awesome. Well, in your time in AUSA, I've been wanting to ask you about these cases. You worked on some really, really high profile cases, and maybe we'll start with the public corruption and politician ones.
Sure.
So you were engaged in the ones against the Calderons.
Yes.
And Jose Huizar. Like, what's that like? That has to be incredibly stressful.
Yeah, I think it's incredibly stressful, and it's both incredibly disheartening as someone who cares a lot about civic engagement, and who's seen, frankly, like local government work well. Again, pointing back to my dad. My dad was a local government official and cared so much about his job and doing it the right way, and like just a man of integrity, and worked with other similar people. And we grew up in Orange County, but it was like, he did not make a lot of money. It was not glamorous at all, but he worked really hard because he cared about his oath. That's what I remember the most. And I said this at my going away, when my dad retired after 35 years. In his speech, what he ended with was something to the kin of, when I took this job 35 years ago, I swore an oath to protect our democracy, protect our county of Orange then, and to do what is right. And I'm proud to say after 35 years, I kept my oath. That's what my dad said his retirement. And that always stuck with me because that's all he did it for. He didn't do it because it was, it's not the NBA or not, something fancy, and he didn't make a ton of money, but he believed so strongly, and it gave him a lot of pride. And in my eyes, he did a lot of good from it. So juxtapose that with where I see people in power who are exploiting it, doing it for personal aggrandizement, whether it's to get some other new job or in more sort of perilous decisions to take money for it, where it's like self enrichment. To me, that's such anathema to true public servants. I was always motivated to do public corruption cases. One of the things when I talked about earlier, I wanted to, challenge the power dynamic where people were corrupt, not just challenging power for power's sake, but because when someone is corrupt at a high level, it infects America and people's view of America so inherently that it threatens the system's survival. Our system is dependent on people believing that Americans want to do good. If that becomes in question, people don't trust jury verdicts. They don't trust laws. They don't trust judges. And that starts with local government. So when I saw that was a problem, but also, again, at the U.S. Attorney's Office, it's something we could address by prosecuting those people. In other countries, that just happens and nothing happens. In America, those people get prosecuted. So that's one of the reasons I went to Yale, surrounded myself with people who had similar mindsets, and ultimately came to the U.S. Attorney's Office, where I did public corruption and civil rights. At the same time, it attracts a lot of attention. You prosecute a sitting elected official, and that sitting elected official, by its very nature, a lot of people like that person. A lot of people voted for that person. A lot of people believe, in some ways, what we found out more is like they may know the person's a little bit shady, a little bit dirty, but they did great stuff for homelessness, or they developed this legislature that helped like the mentally ill. And in a political prosecution case, it is very unusual to find. We're not talking about like, Don Corleone or Al Capone. Like, it isn't an inherently evil person. It's someone who usually did things for the right reason, got into jobs for the right reason, then lost their way. But along the way, they did a lot of good. So that to me was sort of the dichotomy of, look, this public official is corrupting and is a threat to our democracy versus, but he did a lot of great stuff on the way too. And that to me is sort of the epitome of why, as a prosecutor, you focus on the facts and the law and less your personal opinions. And ultimately, the judge will sentence the people and take those factors into account. But for me, if a crime was committed, there's room for discretion and leniency. But when it's a high position of powerful person with a position of power, the threat to our system is so significant that we need to focus on them. The higher you're up, the more damage you can do. And when we have limited federal resources, you want to focus on the cases that have the biggest impact to our community, to industries, and here to our system of government. So I did not shy away from prosecuting people in power because I thought ultimately it could occasion the best and highest good for our community.
Yeah, like there's so much downstream impact.
Exactly.
You mentioned several times in this conversation about this limited resource.
Yes.
Do you think because you look at the stats on like murder, right? Like 50% of murders go unsolved. Like, I know your office did a lot of work, and actually many people got convicted guilty. Like, are there a bunch of stuff that we're just not seeing because we have limited resources to investigate? Like, what's your take on the level of corruption locally?
I think in a white collar case and corruption and sort of financial fraud, which are customarily like white collar cases, I think there is, we are at the tip of the spear. We try to focus on the tip for that down current effect that you just mentioned, because it's just very difficult to uncover. And so the case law and judges say one of the reasons why it's very important in white collar cases to have significant sentences, including prison, is because we don't catch so many other white collar criminals. Because it's very difficult. We're talking about sophisticated individuals. who often if it's a conspiracy, a bribery case, where the evidence is you really need to prove why they did something, what was in their minds, all like evidentiary hurdles that are much more difficult than someone gets killed, there's a dead body. Clearly there is a crime, and it's who did it. In white collar corruption cases, it's this looks bad. Is this a crime? Who did it? Can we prove who did it? And when that last question is like, what's in their mind? There's just a lot of steps that become very difficult. So the sort of consequences, people get away with a lot of things in white collar cases that they wouldn't in other cases. So when you do get someone, particularly someone of significant import or high profile or very powerful, you want to make sure that it isn't treated with a slap on the wrist, because then it becomes a cost equation for those other politicians. Like, okay, well, one, I probably won't get caught if I do this. Two, if I do get caught, I'm probably just gonna get a slap on the wrist. So it becomes a business decision to like, let's take the risk. And again, the studies show that when in that calculus, the second question is answered, well, I could go to prison for a long time. That person is much more likely to say, you know what, maybe I won't take those, Kendrick Lamar tickets, or go on that trip, or make a different decision where, ultimately a lot of corruption is like a little bit by a little bit by a little bit, and then grows and grows. If you stop that process early on, I think it gets that politician or person in power back on the right path, because they know what the consequences for the other avenue.
Yeah, because like you said, like these are sophisticated people, and so they have the ability to, or at least they should, right, have the ability to kind of think strategically, like, and think through their decisions and the potential implications of it.
Absolutely. And so they say in white collar cases, the ability to deter white collar defendants, because they're by their nature strategic, deliberative thinkers, again, as opposed to the murderer, sometimes it's reactionary, or even like the street drug dealers, like, well, I either deal drugs or I'm homeless, or my kids don't eat. Like, I got to do something to provide. Again, not that it exonerates them, but it's certainly a different option tree than someone like who went to Princeton and UCLA Law School, like Jose Huizar, and decides to take illicit funds. Very different, choices and opportunities available.
Yeah. You might not be able to answer this, but when you're prosecuting these cases, sitting politicians, did anyone ever try to like influence you? Like, you get any weird phone calls? Like, or are people just too scared of you guys to do that?
I mean, yeah, it's a good question. I mean, the main people who try to influence us are their attorneys. So I think they had good representatives. But sure, you see, I definitely long ago learned to sort of don't read the comments. But if you look at any article that was talked about a case we prosecuted or someone we charged, again, there's a host of supporters. And so sort of more indirectly, but yeah, not too many people specifically, because I do think part of it is they don't want to get in the target zone. So in many ways, it's sort of, particularly if you get charged, in some ways the other people and other politicians sort of, I wouldn't say turn their back on the people, but aren't trying to go down with the person. But you definitely sense that this is a popular politician who this is going to disrupt things. But to be honest, like, that's true in I counseled our prosecutors, like, that's true when you prosecute a gang member too. That gang member has a family.
Right.
That gang member is somebody's son, somebody's sister, somebody's dad. Like, there are immeasurable consequences to charging someone with a federal crime, whether they're high up in society to down low. But it's also true the high up ones often have higher friends. But I think generally we just deal with the consequences of the case and just focus on that, and ideally just do our job and put your head down, so to speak, and that's the best way to do the job.
Interesting. And just a history question for you. Like, I feel like there's this tendency for every era to feel like it's the most corrupt era. But based on your experience at AUSA and just like your colleagues who may have been there for a long time, like, is it bad as or worse now than it used to be? Like, where are we on the scale of corruption?
I'll answer the question this way, because I majored in political science, but I do have some sense of history. But I think it's always hard to measure history. It's like always a debate I get into my friends, like who's the best basketball player of all time? I'm like, that is a ridiculous question, because it's apples and oranges, even though it's the same sport. Era's different, the ball's different, the rules are different. I feel sort of similarly to crime, because there's so many different factors, including like whether we catch it more or what the technologies are. But I think the best way to put it is, or not the best, but when I started at the U.S. Attorney's Office, there was not a public corruption and civil rights section. It was not in existence. And that was 2008. By 2013, the U.S. Attorney, now Judge Andre Barat, started the public corruption and civil rights section in 2013, where ultimately I became the chief a few years later. And I'll just say since 2013 has been a very, very busy section. But for whatever reason, prior to that, it didn't exist, at least for several years prior to that. So whether that was because the office priorities or administration priorities, attorney general, or because of the lack of crime then, I'll say business has been busy since 2013. And ideally, the goal is, because we're so busy, maybe it can be boring again, and people getting prosecuted, then other people making different decisions. So it becomes less busy. That's sort of, again, the idea is we do a lot of big cases and sort of disrupt that culture of corruption, and then sort of do a reset. But most crimes, I don't think we've solved that era. But I do think doing a lot of them around the same time will have a significant impact going forward.
Yeah, I certainly hope so, because it seems, just as an observer, like there's a lot of this, like it looks, for me looking as an outsider, and it looks like really dumb. Like I forget what the senator who was like taking bribes at gold bars. It's like so dumb. Like just do a book deal or do something else.
Yeah.
Like there's so many other ways
Yeah.
to make some extra dough. It just seems like really short-sighted to me.
Yeah, I think ultimately that is all accurate. I think there's not too many smart criminals, is the adage, and I think that's true for even smart people sometimes.
Another type of case that you worked on a lot, which to me seems kind of scary, is the gang stuff.
Sure.
What's that like?
Yeah, I think scary is one word for it. To me, it was also, again, both heartening and disheartening, in part because in our gang cases, we prosecuted like a 72 defendant case against the Broadway gangster Crips. We had a 50 defendant case against the Pueblo Bishop Bloods. But ultimately what that means is a lot of like low income, predominantly minority defendants from communities that are not thriving. And so the idea, and when this question is asked to me, frankly, as a Black man prosecuting a lot of people of color, and whose dad grew up in a very low income neighborhood, what I learned early on from my dad is like, I want to be in the fight to make things better. And so being in the room where charging decisions are made, but also being in the room where we decide, well, okay, if we prosecute 72 defendants in this neighborhood and remove them from the community, like the park where they had their gang meetings and the playground where there was that shooting, then those become parks and playgrounds again. And instead of gang hangouts, maybe they become what they were meant to be. And maybe that's a start to rehabilitate that community. And that became, something very motivating to me. It's like sort of both dismantling a gang, but also liberating a neighborhood from a gang's entrenchment. And again, I don't want to oversimplify it because it's more complicated than that. But I will tell you, LAPD did a great job at like stats, and the type 1 crimes, they call them, went down after big gang takedowns, as we call them. And sure enough, like not only were those parks and playgrounds populated by actual kids and families, but then they built parks and they built playgrounds and people would go to school. And so I definitely was very proud of our team's work on that. We're really, again, we're not, I don't want to overstate it hyperbolically about transforming communities, but we're certainly impacting them when a kid can go to school without worry of being in a gang shootout or like being jumped into a gang. And when we focus on those communities and seeing like, again, that side of criminal prosecution, like that is certainly, an intention that is behind prosecuting gangs, to see that freedom and that opportunities for the kids that are unfortunately left behind, because we, again, often it would be their uncle or someone that we took off the streets, but also took from them.
And on the legal side, these are like conspiracy cases. Like, how do you get so many people?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, very good question. So my AUSA friend Chris Pelham and I charged one of the first racketeering cases against a Blood or Crips gang. So we used a federal vehicle called the Racketeering Influence Corrupt Organizations Act, RICO, which is originally enacted to charge the mob in New York but basically that use Al Capone again, couldn't always figure out what crimes or prove what crimes or very sophisticated criminal organizations were committing. But you knew they were committing, you could prove they committed a bunch of other things or a bunch of crimes. And so there became this statute that was basically designed to, when a criminal entity becomes so successful that it operates like a business, there should be heightened, there should be a specific crime for it. and heightened punishments for it, which ultimately translates into having additional evidence, having additional defendants you can charge, because you can charge not just the person who shoots the person, but the person who is at the gang meeting saying, hey, we need to commit more violence, or the person committed to, like, who is the lookout for a gang, and put that all in one case as opposed to a bunch of standalone cases where you can charge everybody at the same time. It becomes very daunting for a defendant to be charged with a bunch of the entire gang. And then often what happens is people cooperate. So it's like an Italian mafia-based statute that's been transitioned, and we transitioned to expand to Bloods and Crips gangs in LA. It's also been used, and we used it against the Mexican mafia in Southern California, to really target criminal entities, again, with the eye to dismantle them and sort of free local communities from the, really being terrorized by these effectively sort of domestic terrorism type organizations, at least at the street level.
This is like the MS-13s of the world. And,
absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, MS-13, we charged a case. My other AUSA friend, Joanna Curtis, led this one where they were literally chopping people's heads off in a forest and dumping their bodies over cliffs. Like some of the worst, most abhorrent and sort of nonsensical crimes, but because it was part of their gang ritual. I think it was the time they had to kill a certain amount of people. This is not from a TV show. This is from a criminal indictment and now several guilty pleas, that this is part of their initiation, and a lot of dead people resulted. And that was significant enough to, okay, we need to not just, again, charge this one standalone incident, but, hey, this person who was accused here, if you look back, also participated in this other crime for the gang and this other crime for the gang. And this other person was there at both of them, and he's a senior level member of the gang, but he didn't chop anyone's head off. But we want to include him for that because clearly he was responsible, not this 19, 21-year-old, but the older one. So to wrap them all up shows the full scope of the criminal conduct. And so MS-13 has been and continues to be a focus of the U.S. Attorney's Office in Los Angeles.
And when you're prosecuting a case like that, like you're a dad, here in Los Angeles, like are these gangs like just not going to mess with you? Is that like the rules of the road, or have you ever been worried about it?
Yeah, so I'll say that answer to the question, I think since I'm a dad, similar to my parenting style, I'm worried about everything. But I don't let it affect my ability to do my job, because that to me is then sort of the terrorists win if they have you affect doing your job. So that's always been important to me. But also, yes, there's a logical view that the first people charged defendants would be upset with would be other charged defendants who cooperated against them. They're frankly much more dangerous to them, and there's much more of a feeling of betrayal. So really it's the cooperators, unfortunately. If there's sort of an order of retaliation list, why I think myself and other prosecutors would be on there, really it's the cooperators, the agents who have much more involvement with them. But also, yes, so I've been assigned protective details. I had a bulletproof vest for a while I was wearing in a Mexican mafia case. We had special transportation during a trial. So it is unfortunately a real concern. But, ultimately, at the end of the day, as illogical as some criminals are, usually, taking such extreme action rarely benefits their case and often makes it worse for them.
Yeah, like it's not only does it delay the inevitable, but it like ups the ante. Like if they're going to kill a judge or they're going to try to do something like that. Yeah.
Yeah. And our intelligence also suggested, I think, again, that they do think logically, it's just bad business.
Yeah.
Like if a gang is known for whatever, targeting an enemy and killing an enemy, that's like, horrible as it is, good business, good advertising for the gang. But if a gang is known for targeting a judge or a prosecutor or even their own defense attorney, all that does is bring more media attention, which is going to bring more law enforcement attention. And some of these gang members, like, we don't want any of that. We're not trying to get on people's wanted list. We want to, run our criminal organization in peace. And so the idea that they're going to get more law enforcement attention to the gangs actually significantly discourage that type of imprudent business retaliation.
Yeah, it's like an economic incentive.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I think that most gangs have a strong economic incentive. It's a business. They call it a business for a reason.
Wow, crazy. Well, we're coming to the end here, but I have like a series of unrelated questions, but ones that are to me like super interesting. So I'm just gonna hit them.
It's your podcast, Nick. Shoot away.
But okay, hit you randomly. Okay,
if I say no, that's
then I know why. Yeah. So the first one is more of a personal kind of question, which is, like we just talked about gangs. Like you've been engaging with what I call like the dark side of life.
Yeah. And
you've seen some really nasty stuff. Like what does that do to your psychology?
Yeah, I think it definitely, it's I think being in the criminal justice system certainly isn't for everyone. And again, the reason I think I've been in it for so long is that I definitely feel like where I add value. So being in the dark side or being engaged in sort of the dark side of humanity, the only way I've been able to do it for 17 years is because I also feel like I can bring light to it. And again, not to sound trite, but it's because sort of these cooperators you mentioned, people who've been in the gang their entire life, we charge them with a crime. At some point, they make a choice. Do I want to continue in this life of crime and gang that has literally got me nowhere or worse? Or do I make a decision to cooperate, which means come to tell us everything, ultimately agree to testify against their gang member brethren? And there's so many defendants who choose option B, choose to like, this has got me nowhere. And ultimately what they're choosing is to put their trust in me and in the federal government and in our agents. And that to me is bringing light to a very dark place. And I'll say, I prosecuted more people than cooperated, but I cooperated a lot of defendants whose lives actually did improve. Not all of them, but a lot of them did, including because they had no choice. They could not be in that gang anymore. But also because they saw me, I would meet with them in person. Again, they saw someone in a position of power who cared. I mean, definitely, I cared about prosecuting them, but I also cared about them not being prosecuted again because it's the best for everyone, including them. And having those conversations, looking those people in the eye and seeing like, oh, this guy actually cares about me, not just getting a stat, not just getting the biggest sentence, because cooperating for us is helpful for the case, but it's also a ton of time. It's very risky. We don't need cooperators because in federal court often the evidence is very significant, but these people make a decision to put their trust in me. And I'll say, there's defendants who I prosecuted for significant crimes who still contact me this day, send me baby pictures, wedding announcements, just random pictures of their life. And few things make me prouder, at least from a professional capacity, of seeing someone we prosecuted and gave an opportunity to who seized it. And, that is that light that we created, that light, not just for us, but for the community. That person's going to do good. So I balance it as much as possible. But I think there's those opportunities, because anytime you're blessed or privileged with that amount of power to sort of, impact people's lives, we also have the ability to give people second chances, or at least support when they're on their way to try to reintegrate in society. And I really appreciated that part of the job very much.
Yeah, I could see how that would be super rewarding. And it goes to like the profound nature of the role of the prosecutor in our system and the immense power that they have. These individuals have like incredible discretion to change people's lives. Yeah.
Yeah, it's what I tell people when they interview. Are they ready for? People want to often say, particularly in LA, sort of a little bit of an ego-driven town. Being an AUSA sounds cool. It's like, oh, you're like, oh, you do real stuff. But I'm like, yeah, but with that amount of power, to quote Spider-Man, great responsibility comes with that great amount of power. But what are you going to do with it? And I think, like anything, you want to make sure it doesn't go to your head, but use it for good. And that, I think it's such a privilege to have that amount of power, which is significant, but you got to keep it in check and use it for good, because ultimately no case gets prosecuted unless we choose to charge it. What statutes we charge, what penalties we recommend, it's often the prosecutor and that prosecutorial discretion that dictates where that case goes. And like I would always tell people, it becomes difficult, but not for a second should you take that for granted, that ultimately often you're the most powerful person in that meeting. And sometimes that's like a 28-year-old person, a few years out of law school, maybe several years out of law school. But that's why it's sort of also important to have great supervisors, people you trust, and surrounded with a great community of people who are there at the office doing things for the right reason, not for their resume, not for stats, but because they care about doing right by their community, by our community. When you have that kind of support, I think it helps you keep the august, again, power in check.
Yeah. Two questions in one, and we'll end it. I had somebody on my podcast years ago who was focused on the child trafficking space, and he was working in the nonprofit, and he quoted some statistics that I never really fact checked, but basically talking about like the enormous number of those cases leads that go uninvested in or uninvestigated, and suggesting that there was like the need to maybe like 10x the funding. So the question, this is sort of a compound question.
Sure.
One, do you think that a massive increase in funding for offices like your former office would make a difference? And then if not, like, what's your top criminal justice reform idea? Yeah.
Sure. I think human trafficking gets a lot of attention in part because of what you said, that it seems like a lot of it goes unaddressed. And I would say to that is, I think that's true, but I do think it's actually one of the most well-funded. There are a lot of nonprofits that are exclusively dedicated to human trafficking.
Yeah.
And I say this as a good thing because also to sort of answer your question, resources always matter, particularly in this country. And for criminal prosecution, people think about the federal government as some sort of like omnipotent entity that can find anything, get all the evidence from anywhere, and has all these things. In reality, like in my building, we literally, our elevators didn't work. We didn't have water for 17 years. Like there's no potable water. We didn't have printers. We had one for each floor. Like it's not embarrassment of riches at the federal government. You just had a lot of people who are enriched with mission and purpose and would do whatever it takes to bring a righteous case. But when other places had entities that had money, like that was super helpful. So there are a lot of nonprofits in that space that were super helpful. Specifically, and without getting too much detail, because it's a whole nother podcast, human trafficking is difficult because you're often dealing with children or victims that are so traumatized that the last thing they want to do is testify, talk to law enforcement, or really know any different to change their life. And so when you have someone that's so traumatized, and again, speaking in a place where you need to prove some element of coercion or force, or some that they're doing it against their will, particularly if it's an adult, it becomes very difficult because these are not the top members of society. These are people who their families and society have forgotten. And so they're not eager to trust government. Like, oh, come with us, we'll make your life better. They're like, okay, what are you going to do? Like, I have very little skills. Like, this is the one thing I'm good at, and I make sometimes decent money. Sure, I have to put up with this, and I'm trafficked and do all these horrible things. It becomes very difficult because of those victims suffer through so much trauma. So these days, the way we've advanced it is just a lot more digital evidence. So where we would put on those cases without the victim, who would sometimes testify for the defense. Like, oh no, I didn't. I agreed to all this. And like, here's you being beaten on video that he filmed, and you're saying that was voluntary. Yes. So it's just a really tragic situation. And so I think the biggest area of criminal justice reform, I think, continues to be for me more collaboration between federal and local entities, and I think the depoliticization of like well-meaning efforts. Sort of coming back to where we began, criminal justice reform, I think, is a good effort, but has again become so demonized or so supported that instead of bringing people together, it's pushed them farther apart. And so to me, the most urgent criminal justice reform, and this is sort of evading the answer, is that just more thoughtful people come at it from an honest perspective of trying to realize that we still needs a work in progress. And because someone wants criminal justice reform doesn't mean that there's some bleeding heart who doesn't care about crime victims. And if someone's against criminal justice reform, so to speak, doesn't mean that there's some heartless, soulless person that just wants to lock up all minorities. Like, there's such a big middle that if that middle could get into a room and actually talk through the issues, I think real justice and real reform can happen. And I'm hopeful because people continue to have these conversations like we're having, Nick, about those nuances and about those similarities. So I'm hopeful, again, that can happen.
I think you're right. I feel like if people on either sides of that got together, they realized that they actually kind of agree on a lot of stuff.
They do.
And if they just didn't read the newspaper, and they actually talk to each other, they would do it.
Yeah.
I feel like the more I think about this issue, like the truth is that when you're dealing with with crime, we want to treat it as some kind of systemic thing because that's the language we're used to using, like prisons and laws.
Sure.
But the truth is every single person needs an individual life intervention.
Yeah.
The problem with that is that it's incredibly costly. Like, how many psychologists do you want to pay for and whatnot? But that's the truth. Like, if you really wanted to end crime, you probably could do it, but it would just cost an enormous amount of money. You'd have to intervene in young kids' lives in neighborhoods with enormous support resources, but you could probably get it done.
I think that's right. I made this joke that I definitely don't want to be a politician. Well, that's the serious part. But if I ever was a politician, my one mandate, my one executive order would be that everyone goes to therapy.
Yeah.
I think, but that's costly.
It's really costly. Yeah.
Really costly. So like many plans, I have not figured out how to fund them. But if we figure out how to fund it, but yeah, I think mental health, and again, someone intervening, like you said, and just some people being shown that that people care about them as a person, and then ideally having some expertise to deal with their issues. Because I think it is a human issue more than a systemic issue.
Totally. Mack, well, thanks for doing this, man. This was
Thank
a
you,
fascinating conversation. And I'm super excited to see what you do with the LA office of Hecker Fink. It sounds like a very cool place. And I know you're going to, take this mission-driven energy and apply it in a cool direction. So I'm excited to see what happens.
You and me both, Nick. I appreciate that very much. Thanks for the time.
Yeah, man. Thank you.